Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So hello everyone, and welcome to part 4 of our Tools to Engage webinar series. Today's discussion will be focusing on the racial wealth gap learning simulation, and one organization that has had the experience of actually applying the tool. So please note that attendees are automatically in listen-only mode, so we can't hear or see you, but we definitely do encourage you to use the chat function to ask questions at any time. I'll be monitoring that. And then there'll be sort of a more formal opportunity for questions and answers a little bit later towards the end of the webinar. Okay, so let's get started. So just a little bit of an introduction in today's agenda. We have a really packed 60 minutes for you. We're going to start just with an introduction of Building Movement Project. For your hosts for today's webinar and the whole Tools to Engage webinar series. So we'll just let you know, if this is your first time tuning in to one of our webinars, sort of what the Tools to Engage webinar series is. And then we'll be hearing about the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation tool, sort of how it came into being, what that process was like. And then the application piece, so what it was like actually going through the process of applying the tool, and what some of the impacts of that application were. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers from the participants towards the end of this session. And then we'll leave you with some additional tools and resources to take home to your organizational context. And just again, for folks who may just be joining the call, you are all in listen-only mode, so we can't hear or see you, but we definitely encourage you to use that chat function, your Zoom chat function, to ask questions at any point during the webinar. All right, so today's presenters. Marlysa, you want to start and introduce yourself?
Yes, hi everyone. I am so excited that everyone decided to spend an hour of your time with us to learn about the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation. My name is Marlysa D. Gamblin. I work as a domestic advisor for Bread for the World Institute, and it's part of Bread for the World, which is a large Christian organization that works to end hunger and poverty in the U.S. and also abroad. And we focus on federal policy and advocacy, and we work with a series of a ton of denominations. We do a lot of work in churches. We also do a lot of work advocating in the administration for good policy, and then also in Congress. So a lot of my portfolio is around the domestic side of things, where I essentially look at closing the racial and gender hunger and income gap. And within that, you can imagine that the topic of race is critical, which is one of the reasons why I created the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation. So I'll go ahead and I'll leave it there, and I'm really excited to go ahead and pass it off to Marla.
Thanks, Marlysa and Noelia. So nice to be on this webinar with you all today, and I hope that some of what we share will be helpful to you all. Just introducing myself here, my name is Marla Karina Larrave. I work at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, based here in DC, in Washington, DC, but we are a coalition, so we are all over the country in a sense. And I am originally from Los Angeles and have been at the coalition for about 3 years. I am all about grassroots and mobilizing and movement building, and we intersect that in our federal policy and advocacy also with racial equity. That's a big part of my role, making sure that we are applying a racial equity lens to food and sustainable agriculture in all that we do.
Great. Thank you both so much. And I'm Noelia Mann. I work with the Building Movement Project based here in New York, and we're your hosts for today's webinar. Just before we move on, I got a question about this. Yes, you will all be receiving the slides and a recording of this webinar. So if folks have to jump off early, everyone who has registered will be receiving the recording. And also, if you don't catch every word, don't worry, we got you. Okay. So now that you know sort of who we are, we'd love to get a sense of who's in the room. So I'm just going to run this quick poll. If you can tell us what type of organization you work for, we'd love to get a sense of who's here with us today. We'll give folks just a few more seconds to respond. Excellent. Okay. So you should all be able to see the results of the polling here. So it looks like we've got some nonprofit service organizations here in the audience today, as well as some nonprofit intermediary groups, some foundations, wonderful, government, self-employed, some other nonprofits. Excellent, about 26%, fabulous. Okay. And then I have a second question for you. If you could let us know sort of what title best fits your current role, and I'll do another poll here for you. Okay. Thanks so much. Just getting a sense of who is in the audience is so helpful for us. Great. Thank you. All right, so it looks like we have about 43% organizational leaders. That's excellent. We're so happy to have you here. And I know Marlysa and Marla have a lot to share with you all. Organizational staff, about 30%. That's fabulous. We have some outside capacity builders as well, and about 10% capacity builders internal to organizations. So great. Nice variety here today. And we have some constituents as well. Fabulous. Excellent. Okay. So thank you for doing that with us. And I just want to give you a little bit of a background as to the Building Movement project before I turn it over to Marlysa and Marla for the good stuff. But the Building Movement project is a national research organization, and we really do research to support, challenge, and push nonprofit organizations to be focused on social change. And we do that by focusing on three main areas. The first is leadership, where we look at who leads organizations and how leaders structure their organizations. And over the last 2 years, we've really been focusing on the Race to Lead data, which explores barriers to leadership within the nonprofit sector for people of color. The second area is service and social change, which focuses on how organizations, especially human service organizations, can support the voice and power of the people they serve. So the tools to engage work is a part of that focus area. And then the third focus area is movement building, where we look at how organizations collaborate and work together to have more impact than they would on their own. So what's the Tools to Engage webinar series? As I mentioned, this is the fourth in the series. And for folks who are just hopping in for their first time, I know we have some veterans here as well. But the Tools to Engage is actually a website. It's not as new as it was, but a relatively new website that's just chock full of research, resources, and tools from across the social sector to really support organizations in aligning their principles with their practices. And of course, today's tool is among the 100+ resources available for free on the site. So the webinar series is a way to lift up certain tools that have been particularly helpful to folks, and also to highlight the work that organizations across the country are doing to align their values with their practices. The series and the tools as well are focused on minimizing the gap between access to power and those directly impacted by various issues. So with that, I want to turn it over to Marlysa, who is going to tell us about today's tool, the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation. Take it away, Marlysa.
Thank you so much, Noelia. Yes, I am excited to dive deeper. So the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulation is really a good tool for folks to use as maybe a first step for organizations who may not know how, what that first step might look like in terms of racial equity. It's also really good in terms of building buy-in for a lot of organizations to help kind of build that case for why racial equity is so critical to really achieving pretty much anyone's bottom line, because it helps beyond just any one particular topic. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide where I can share a little bit more about Bread for the World Institute. So I shared before that a lot of our work is really on the federal level with advocacy, and a lot of my work, as well as my colleagues' work, who works in international affairs, and for me, it's particularly domestic. I do a lot of work with advising congressional leaders on legislation and policy, as well as trying to advise the administration and different federal agencies to think about ways of implementing this equity lens. Obviously, we have a lot more work to do, but that's why I think the momentum of everyone on this webinar is so important, because it really is a collective effort to ensure that everyone is kind of going in line towards applying that equity lens. So with our efforts, we're really praying and hoping that we can help to contribute to the goal of ending hunger and poverty in the US and then also abroad by the year 2030. So I guess without any further ado, it might be helpful for us to just dive right into the racial wealth gap learning simulation. There's a video that we have for you to set everything off.
All right. Can you all see the video okay? Is it showing up on your screen? I always get anxious about moving between screens.
I can see it. It's not full screen yet, though.
Okay. Here we go.
Interactive, revealing, very impactful. The simulation reminds me that I have a role in making this work. The simulation helps engage people on the topic of race and hunger. This simulation creates a contextual way, a concrete way for people to understand the functioning of systemic forces. And then it prepares them in such a way that they can help others have difficult conversations about the subject of race. In the simulation, each person is assigned a race that is not his or her own race. So it gets you out of your comfort zone and helps you see a different viewpoint. It allows you to experience a more direct connection to the policies that are being passed. So it really shifts you from a space of intellectualizing to a space of feeling. It was empowering and not making me feel guilty. I think that there are some there's a potential with an exercise like that to sort of feel blame or feel guilt, and particularly as a white person. But this was much more educational and empowering than making me feel guilty. The simulation is really designed to meet people where they are. So for the person who's just starting out, it's a good learning tool and it's a great first step. But for the expert, it's a value add because it provides the quantitative impact that each policy has. So you see policies that on the surface maybe appear neutral or even beneficial to some, but you see the detrimental impacts to communities of color in particular. And you see that pattern building and reinforcing itself over time through policies. The fact that you walk through history, and when you're sitting at a table with other friends, colleagues, parishioners, that you are in a space where you can have conversation and you can actually experience the feelings that your neighbor may have had while you're learning about a sensitive issue. The Alliance has already shared and continues to share the simulation with our network, which is private sector entities, faith-based organizations, nonprofits, universities, healthcare systems. We really hope that they're all going to take it and begin using a racial equity lens across their work, particularly as it relates to food security, but hopefully even beyond that. The simulation will help people understand the causes of hunger, and that will lead to effective action.
Okay, so I got a couple comments that the video was coming in a little choppy for folks. I'm so sorry. It might have been our how we're broadcasting it over this webinar platform. So I apologize, but it is on the Bread for the World Institute website, which Marlysa is going to be sharing with us later. So you can all find this video on YouTube and watch it on your own. It might have not been the case for everyone, so apologies for those folks who had that coming in a little bit choppy. But Marlysa and Marla are going to tell us about it in person much better anyway. All right. So we did want to have an opportunity, just by way of introduction, as we're launching this conversation about talking about race and race equity and how do we open the door for that conversation, just to facilitate a little bit of self-reflection about the extent to which you feel your organization, or in the case of capacity builders, the organizations that you work with, are attempting to apply a racial equity lens to their work. And for our purposes, we're defining race equity as the systemic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in the equitable opportunities and outcomes for all, which is language we're borrowing from Race Forward. But do you want to add any comments to that, Marlysa?
Yeah, I want to say that when we're thinking about racial equity, I think it's important for folks to know that it is different than diversity. Racial equity really focuses on equal outcomes as opposed to, let's say, equality that only focuses on opportunity, but then it doesn't necessarily take into account the discrimination that one experiences through an institution and through processes that actually result in disparities that we see today. So if we're thinking about applying a racial equity lens, then there are byproducts of that. Diversity is one of those byproducts, but it should not be confused with diversity, if that makes sense.
That's so helpful. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and just launch this poll so we can get a sense of where folks feel that they're at right now. All right. Great. Excellent. So I'm really excited to see that about 38% of respondents feel that their organizations are really extensively attempting to apply a racial equity lens to their work. That's really exciting. And we'll also get a little bit of framing about how this tool really is appropriate no matter where you are on the journey of incorporating race equity into all the work that you're doing in your organization. And then we've got, some nice variety here in terms of about 25% feel their organizations are doing this a bit, about 18% feel somewhat, 15% of respondents are saying their organizations aren't really attempting to apply a racial equity lens to their work, and we have about 7% who are saying not at all. So we're hoping this will also give folks some ideas for how to start this conversation if that's where you're at. Great. Okay, so because we're lucky enough to have Marlysa with us, who's really the designer on this simulation, we're really excited to ask you some questions about how this tool came into being, what the process was, but I'd really love to start with you just telling us what exactly the tool is. What is it?
Awesome, and I want to be cognizant, I see some comments on the volume, so I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me, and go ahead and If you can't hear me, then chime in, and then we'll try to address that. But the racial wealth gap learning simulation is an interactive learning experience, and it really helps to walk people through a series of 13 policies that have had the most influential economic impact in creating what we now see today as the racial hunger, income, and wealth divides. And in the picture to the right, what you're seeing is people doing the simulation. And folks have a series of money, land, and opportunity lost cards. What they did before getting to this point, which you can see in the picture, is they blindly selected a race card. So half of the participants in each table selected a white participant race card, and the other half selected a Black participant race card. And throughout each of the 13 policies, each participant has the opportunity to read the policy as well as read the impact, the economic impact of that policy. And depending on what that economic impact was, then participants are instructed to pick up or put down a series of the action cards, which were the money cards, the land cards, and then the lost opportunity cards. And the reason we have the lost opportunity cards is really to acknowledge the fact that regardless of how much research I can do, we will never truly know the full economic impact of discrimination simply because we don't have a direct counterfactual of how our world would look like without it. So I wanted to also mention that at the end, people with white participant race cards end up with 13 money cards. And half of the participants with Black participant race cards end up with 1, and the other half end up with 0. So the idea is that the 13-to-1 disparity, if you will, really represents what the wealth gap is between whites and Blacks in the United States today. So that's a real disparity. But often in my work, and I'm sure that a lot of you doing a lot of work related to race equity, you might get the question of, well, why do we have to focus on race? Can we focus on class instead? That's a little bit more unifying for people. Mm-hmm. And to address that in a very kind of nuanced way, I really wanted to dig up some analysis to help us understand why race is important. So I actually looked at the wealth disparities among people who are near the poverty line. So when you look at households that are near the poverty line and you disaggregate it based on race, then you actually see that the white-Black wealth divide actually increases. It increases to 18-0. So that's one of the reasons why for the Black participants, we actually had half of them that ended up with 1 wealth card, right? But then the other half end up with 0, was so that we could express this and we can have this conversation that no, we cannot just talk about class. Class is important. We have to talk about class, but we cannot limit it to class. We have to talk about race because we know that within class, that race still matters. And it's even exacerbated among those who are living in the lowest of income, lowest income households. So yeah, I'll go ahead and let's go to the next slide. So I actually see a question. Is there any other data on other races? So yes, there is data on other racial groups and other documents that are linked to the simulation. So when we go to the simulation's website, then I will go ahead and walk you through it, and then you'll see that there's a policy packet. Within that policy packet, we have a ton of different resources. This really provides, we focus on the Black-white wealth divide for a couple of reasons. One, it's actually the highest, it's the starkest. But two, the main idea behind the simulation is just to get people talking about race and to share with people how structural racism was created, right? So while it would be ideal to kind of share every single racial and ethnic group, the thing is that to do it justice, you probably would need about between 10 and 20 cards for each racial group. So, and I've done that, you're really looking at like a 6-hour simulation versus a 30-minute simulation. So the idea is to kind of make it quick, easy, and I think for me, I selected the black-white because that's where the starkest is. And when we're thinking about how policy was created in America, it was based on the antithesis of whiteness, which is blackness, which I think is why we see that the disparity is the highest among black and white. Awesome. So let's go ahead and go to who can use the simulation. Yay. Noelle, I think I stole your thunder. I think you were supposed to ask me that. I'm sorry.
That's okay. You did great.
So it's really versatile. Honestly, it's very diverse. So many people and organizations, communities, and coalitions have used it, including service-based nonprofits, advocacy nonprofits, research institutions. When we're thinking about that, we've done it with actual like think tanks. We've done it with folks who have been at universities, and some really exciting news is that it's actually being administered to school districts in Dayton, Ohio. So among other schools, of course, but that was district-wide. So I thought that was kind of exciting. It's also been administered to various community stakeholders, including folks who work in government, work in foundations, all of that stuff, as well as faith communities. And we've seen it really transition the way that even churches relate to one another in thinking about how they spend their money, thinking about land, and thinking about even their internal culture and so on and so forth. So I just want to encourage you, regardless of what field you're in, regardless of where you are geographically, you can use it. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. It was piloted to so many people for that reason, because we want to make sure that it can be of use to a diverse audience of various educational level, as well as field. So yes.
Are you letting me answer the question this time? What purpose does the simulation serve? Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what some of the intended outcomes are?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest ones is that it helps people talk about race. We all have barriers and baggage when talking about race. Let's just be real, right? And we're socialized to not talk about it. But I think about our country like a family, right? You can have a problem in a family, right? But if you don't address that problem and you just kind of gloss over it, then you're still gonna have that problem and it'll probably end up growing, right? So that's how I think about race in America. We're a big family, but we're not talking about it. So what we're seeing is that the disparities are growing. So we wanna be able to talk about it in a comfortable and a productive way that'll get us to real change. So it does that. I think it also helps to bring everyone on the same page about how policy created structural racism. A lot of people, I think, in different fields might accept the fact that there is different types of racism, but a lot of folks don't know how it happened. And it's helpful to know how it happened so that we don't repeat it with our current actions and with what we're currently advocating for, or even with our current policy design, whatever it is, so that we can actually move forward. And then in addition, it also provides the economic impact of racial discrimination, which for me is really, I think, important for people to actually understand that it's not just this interpersonal thing. It actually has real economic impact that impact a lot of social issues that many of us care about: education, housing, jobs, hunger, poverty. You name it, it's almost everything. It's interconnected. So if you care for whatever topic you care about, we have to understand that it has an economic impact, right? And then also, I think it's a first step for many organizations to start shifting their internal culture, because maybe while most folks kind of understand that there's structural racism, we don't understand how we're maybe exacerbating it through our internal culture, and how we may not be addressing it through our policy design or service design or advocacy design, for example.
Great. So just before we move on to this slide, we're getting some fabulous questions in the chat box. Thank you all so much for engaging so actively. There is going to be a Q&A section at the end, so we'll make sure to come back to all of those questions if we don't answer them. I just don't want people to think they're being ignored. But in the meantime, Marlysa, can you tell us a little bit about how this simulation came into being?
Yes. So I started off, I would say, my career as an organizer, and I was doing organizing against police brutality. And I think obviously with that, looking at race and talking about it is kind of a given, right? But I noticed that, you know, from there to even being in grad school, to working on the Hill, to working in different nonprofits, even being a capacity builder, an intermediary, which I know we have a ton on the call, which I'm excited about, to even helping to advise the White House, I've gotten the same question, regardless of where I am in the country, regardless of who I'm speaking to, and regardless of what field it is. Why do we have to talk about race? And with my personal journey, I've realized that I'm not able to get the job that I know God's called me to do on this earth without talking about race, right? And I know that a lot of you aren't able to reach into your fullest capacity of your organizational goals and so on and so forth without talking about it. And because of that, I felt like I needed to, I felt like some tool needed to be created that allowed people to talk about race in an inviting way, that also brought people up to speed, because no one wants to read, I mean, maybe you all might want to, but a lot of people don't want to read my briefing papers or dissertations or anything like that, right? Because it just takes too much time. These are all barriers. And the idea is that the simulation is kind of a quick kind of entry point that helps to break down those barriers by time, because it's only 30 minutes, right? When thinking about talking about race, it's more game-like. So people feel a little disassociated from their own personal experience, and therefore they're not bringing in their baggage. And I noticed that when people kind of have their barriers up, then learning does not take place. So the idea is that you want to have people learning, because through learning, you can actually have effective dialogues, right? But once your barriers are up, you're no longer listening, and you're defensive, and you're just, it's kind of a non-starter. So that's kind of how the simulation came into being.
Great, thanks. So can you tell us about the creation process? And I know we got a question specifically about the pilot and what groups the simulation was piloted with. There was a question as to whether it was ever tested in schools. So tell us a little bit about this creation process.
Awesome. So, okay, very, very long, very thoughtful. So we had a pre-pilot before we had the pilot. And I actually had a few pre-pilots. I had an official pre-pilot with some folks here, and I made sure that it was racially diverse. And the idea was that we actually kind of went through the entire simulation to kind of see where some of those kinks were. And I had already done that before, but it was just helpful to get fresh eyes. And I was responsive, and I made some changes that needed to be made. And then I had the official pilot actually with a group from all over the country who came to a particular conference at the time. And these were folks who were diverse in age, as well as career, as well as race, and where they lived. So with that, what I actually did was I solicited feedback, because I wanted more feedback. And I went back to the drawing board, and I continued to make those tweaks. And then from there, I actually rolled it out at different organizations and had official assessments. So physical papers whereby people rated the simulation, they rated, they gave feedback of kind of what worked and what they learned. And I also got information about where they sat in that organization and what their previous knowledge point was, so that I can understand, some trends of, okay, well, it seems like folks who are already knowledgeable about the simulation might think this. And it seems like folks who may have been apprehensive about talking about race tend to appreciate this, and so on and so forth. And one thing that I was really sensitive about was different learning styles, and also the fact that not everyone graduates from high school, right? My mom, she ended up getting her GED, but she originally didn't graduate from high school. So my thought is always, how can this be inclusive and effective for people who are like my mom, right? Who understand the issues from lived experience, but you know, we need to make sure that the language is accessible, all the way to me, where I have my master's and I would consider myself an expert academically, right? And I want value add. So I was really intentional about making sure that everyone had an opportunity to weigh in, and actually went all over the country and did this, as well as had colleagues do it. And we did it even with looking at the impact of what it was with like same race facilitators with folks in the room, as well as different race facilitators, and looking at the different dynamics. And I observed a lot. So, and all of that is reflected in the facilitator's guide, which we'll go into later. So we had that year-long pilots and reviews, and I took in everything just to make sure that, you know, folks can actually use it, right? And it's helpful. And then we had our official launch, so that I no longer have to be the one to, you know, fly out and do the simulation, but instead you can bring it to your own community, you can bring it to your own job, and it's online. As far as it being piloted in different schools, so we actually have an organizer in Florida who has been doing it with some high schoolers, and it's gone well. And I think it's really good. It affirms, I think, their lived experience, but it also helps to enhance their educational opportunities, because unfortunately a lot of this is not taught in the school. And then I know a teacher in New York, when I presented at Harvard, she actually has some, I think, middle or high school students who she also did it with. And like I mentioned before, it's actually being rolled out in Dayton School District. So I think the school system is a very, very good way to kind of help facilitate this learning for sure.
Great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. So I guess now, since you've heard from me, let's go ahead and hear from Marla. Marla used, or actually invited me to do the simulation at her job. And I would love for you, Marla, to introduce yourself. And then from there, I can ask you a few questions about the impact. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. Thanks,
All right.
Marlysa. So yes, I had the good fortune of stumbling across Marlysa here when she was rolling out the simulation at Bread for the World, and we got to talking afterwards, and I said, this is fantastic. I was blown away by it. You know, let's chat and see how we can collaborate. I'd love to bring something like this to my organization. And I'll fill you in some more about that backstory shortly. But just to give you an overview as to who we are, as I mentioned before, we're the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which is a mouthful. So we say NSAC for short. And who we are a grassroots alliance of over 100 member organizations. I think we're like at 130 or so at the moment, around the country, working together to improve federal food and farm policy. The coalition has been around for 30 years and has focused primarily on bringing voices of small and medium scale, I guess we'll say family farmers, but you know, that applies to young beginning farmers, etc., to policy discussions here in Washington, D.C. I know that many of you are probably engaged in national level policy and advocacy, so you know that there's a lot of voices and a lot of money out there weighing in on the different issues we all work on. And for us, the one power that we do have is people power. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we bring folks that are representing, you know, family farmers, smaller scale farmers to DC to be meeting with members of Congress, federal agencies to, you know, talk about their experiences. And not only farmers, but as well communities that are in relationship with farmers that are being impacted by, anything from environmental practices and farming to the foods that are produced. We focus primarily, but not exclusively, on the Farm Bill, which is a big federal piece of legislation you're all probably hearing about lately, and as well as implementation of the Farm Bill and annual appropriations for food and agriculture programs. How we work, I was hinting at this a little bit before, but basically the line is we've got farmers, ranchers, and stakeholders connected to our member groups all across the country. So when I say all across the country, I mean from California to North Carolina to Texas, up to the Midwest, across to the Northeast here. Really got folks all over. And together we are NSAC, the coalition, and we meet with Congress and federal agencies. So all of that, which is to say that our priorities and work that we choose are based by the needs of our grassroots stakeholders and practitioners, as well as partners and allies in the space. And that's it for me.
Okay, awesome. And I want to be mindful of the fact that we only have about 15 minutes, and maybe we can go over to about 3:05 or something like that. But maybe in the next 7 minutes or so, I can go ahead and ask you some questions. So first, let's talk about the impact of the simulation, and we can start with the internal impact of the simulation.
Yeah, and by internal, like what was it like for us as a team? I'll get that across. So Marlysa was talking before about, the topic of race and how uncomfortable it can be to talk about sometimes. And it's true, right? I think we've all experienced being in a room before where it's like the elephant in the room. So for us, it definitely reduced the discomfort in having conversations on racial injustice and the need for equity. I think a key part of that was the arbitrary assignment of whether you were a white participant or a Black participant. It allowed you to approach the space in a very different way than you would, bringing your identity into the room. I'd say another key part was that, we do policy. We're a bunch of wonks, but it definitely increased our knowledge as staff members about the importance of, there's all these policies that, you might work on, but for all the reasons Marlysa laid out before, it's extremely important to apply a racial equity lens. We're not getting at, the most impacted or who needs to be at the front lines if we're not applying that lens.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to go ahead and note that with the reduced discomfort and the increased knowledge that Marla discussed as an impact of the simulation, both of those actually contribute to internal buy-in, which is critical if we're thinking about a cultural shift in the organization. So let's go ahead and get on the impact of the simulation externally.
Yeah, so externally, what came out of that for us was that we quickly realized we needed to do some additional research on resources that ensured we were not just looking at the policies, but we're taking into account, the historical context. There's these, long line of inequities that are outlined in the simulation. So how are we taking that into account? And, we need resources to do so. And now, not only have we done, some research on gathering racial equity toolkits, for example, we're practicing it ourselves in a more integrated way through our priority setting process. And in that process, helping our members and sometimes partners think through how we might apply a racial equity lens in our work. And I want to, be very upfront and honest here in saying that by no means are we an expert, and by no means are we going out and, teaching folks. We're simply sharing our experiences and also learning from other folks that maybe are further down the process in applying a racial equity lens.
Yeah, and I just want to go ahead and note that for Marla's organization, it's an advocacy organization, right? But this can also be, this feeling, this impact can be translated into other types of organizations. So it may change the way in which, you do advocacy, right? It may change your, and it should change the design of your advocacy. It should also, if you're a policy organization or research organization, change the design and the processes by which you conduct research. So how is your methodology, right, changing to reflect a racial equity lens? And the same as if you are a service-based organization, how is your service provision changing from charity to justice, right? And how is it really centering the needs of people of color? Let's go ahead and go to some challenges. So we've structured this section to learn about the challenges that came up for you before the simulation, during the simulation, and after the simulation. Let's start with before the simulation.
Yeah. So obviously, I think all of you that are on this webinar are here because you care about these issues. And likewise, that's why we invited Marlysa to come in and share, this wonderful tool with us. We care about, racial equity, but it can feel like racial equity is additional work rather than a different way of doing the work. So that's always the challenge. Before the simulation, as I mentioned, folks were not as comfortable talking about race, and organizational buy-in, right? You need to be able to, as a collective, say, we're going to set aside this time and take this learning and apply it to the work that we do.
And just as a little bit of food for thought for the before piece, some ways to make it not seem like additional work is just by framing it. So this is not additional work. It's just a new way of doing our work, right? Or if folks are more concerned about the bottom line, we could say, this is our bottom line. For Bread for the World, it's to end hunger. If we want to end hunger, we have to look at who is more likely to experience hunger. And if we look at who's more likely to experience hunger, then it requires that we talk about race. So the reframing is important. I think also too, just some practical ways that you can think about encouraging staff members is to provide food. A lot of people have provided food, and then there are a lot of folks who come. I think another thing is building it into an existing piece of whatever staff members are already doing, like an all staff meeting, for example. I've seen that be helpful because then people can't make the argument of, I don't have the time, because they already have it booked in their schedule. And then another strategy that I've seen organizations do, if all of those other things don't work, is pull in a small group of people, make sure that it has folks from all different tiers of the organization and all different racial groups, as well as some unexpected, suspects, right? And make sure that it's a small group. They do the simulation, and then through word of mouth, they actually build momentum and say, oh my gosh, the simulation is really good. I learned about this, I learned about this. And then you'll actually build out advocates within the organization to actually push the organization to have those conversations.
Yeah, and Marlysa, I'm so glad you mentioned that. In saying that, you actually reminded me for the different way of doing the work, and we were talking about it a little bit before, we've started to look even more so at demographic data in the policies and federal programs and grants that are distributed to see, okay, what is the impact across different race, ethnicities of these programs or grants, loans, etc.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and go to during. I'm excited to hear this.
Yeah, so during, and I think I kind of was mentioning this a little bit before, but it was great, engaged in the learning, and I think we all experienced that. But, we are policy wonks. So there's still kind of the staying in the brain space rather than, applying the learnings. And that was something that was coming up. One way in which we saw that was that when Marlysa took us through some reflection questions towards the end of the simulation, all the things that applied, that were more applied, how would you apply this in your work? I'm there. Those are hard for us, and I'll say there was silence in the room. I think underpinning that is that our organization. So at the bottom of that, always is the land and enslavement of peace in terms of today working within. So, that's difficult. That's difficult to grapple with. And we're finding our way.
Yeah, and I think that one way to combat that, because I think if you look at really any field, right, it's gonna kind of date back to some of their involvement or exacerbation in, you know, sustaining racism in different forms, right? So I think what I've noticed is a good shift is you didn't create it, but it's your responsibility to make sure that we resolve it, right? And I know that when I was working at the NAACP, one of my colleagues was just like, okay, who was born in 1600s? Who was born in the 1700s? And no one raised their hand. And they're like, great. So you didn't create these systems, but it's your responsibility to change them. And I think doing that kind of helps people remove their inquisition to become defensive. And it allows kind of everyone to have this invitation of working together. All right, let's go to after.
Yeah, so ongoing challenges, I mean, we've been talking about them as before, during, after, and I'll say, you know, maybe you see different glimpses throughout, but ongoing commitment or an organizational buy-in, I mean, I'm sure you all have experienced this. This is ongoing. You know, keep renewing that commitment and keep, as a collective, staying on the same page that this is important. You know, we are trying to address a historical context of hundreds of years of inequities, as Marlysa was saying. You know, it's a responsibility sitting with, so we need to keep going. Investment of time, willingness, trust to apply this lens is required. There needs to be trust that, okay, good intentions, but we're going to trust in each other and hold each other accountable, as well as, you know, any partners that we might be working with in the space, sure that they can also hold us accountable. And I would say, yeah, organizations, you know, many of our members are eager to apply a racial equity lens, but we recognize that we don't know everything. And so we need to continue to find additional tools as appropriate.
Yeah, and I just want to go ahead and say that one way to deal with the challenge of this ongoing commitment, I think, is ensuring accountability. And the question then becomes, well, how do you ensure accountability? And I think creating like a racial equity statement that's, you know, outwardly facing. I know NSAC has done that. That way, it's like, okay, well, this is outwardly facing. We need you to live up to that, right? And I think other organizations have done that, and I think that's been helpful. I think also sharing the simulation and your goals with your partners so that they can actually hold you accountable, and even your membership. So that's kind of how it is with us. Our membership is saying, we want you all to focus on this. We want you all to apply this. And if they're saying that, we have to be responsive to our members. So I think being strategic with kind of your pressure points, understanding that it can't all come internally, and that external pressure is just kind of the most strategic, sustainable way that you can kind of hold your organization accountable. I guess right now we can go ahead and hurry up to some of the tips and the tools. And if we can, yes, so please visit bread.org/simulation and read the facilitator's guide. And I'm thinking it would probably be helpful for you to see the website. So Noelia, can you go ahead and pull that up for us? It's very, very intuitive, I promise. It has the video that we shared. So if we just scroll down just a little bit more, you'll see it has the explanation of what it is. You have the first video on the left. That's the video that unfortunately we had technological difficulties pulling up. So please go back, and I know that Noelia will send this to everyone. Please go back and view it. It's only 3 minutes. You'll see that there's another video on your right, and it's a kind of how to bring this to your community. And it provides all of the tips that you need, all the way from preparation to during the simulation to even cleanup, everything that you need. And it's only about 7 minutes. So that's really helpful. And I think the last thing, if you go down, it's very, very helpful because it provides all of the downloadable simulation resources. So it has the print kit, that's gonna actually be the actual simulation. So the ones the simulation that has the race cards, the participant policy cards, all of those items. It tells you all the instructions based on how large or small your group is. All of that's there. There's also the facilitator's guide, which I want to go into a little bit more depth in a little bit. There's a policy packet also, which you'll see that is helpful for you as a facilitator, just to kind of feel more comfortable. You don't have to be an expert, honestly, you don't. Read the policy packet and you'll be good. And it has a lot of the calculations and the economic background that I use to develop a lot of this. And I think it's important to note, I used very conservative numbers. So it's probably going to be much larger if I didn't, but nonetheless, it still shows the disparity. It also has a biblical activity sheet for folks who are wanting to provide that biblical reference. And then it also has a PowerPoint, and don't worry, it has talking points. So there's no need to have to worry about what you're gonna say, how you're gonna say it. There's even jokes embedded, so you'll be good. Let's go ahead and go to the facilitator's guide. And the facilitator's guide is money, okay? So if we go down and down and down, I think on page 5, actually the guiding principles. So there's a few things that this facilitator's guide has. The first thing is the guiding principles. And I think reading through that is helpful. It provides all of the different things that you need in order to bring it to your community. It also has different nuances, like don't call this a game, call it a simulation. And it provides the actual rationale behind that so that we're understanding how to be culturally sensitive and to historical trauma. I think if we go down from there, we'll see other helpful things like the instructions and just kind of quick questions like how long should it take and so on and so forth. And if we go down after that, I believe we have the frequently asked questions. If we just go, I think down to maybe page, oh wait, actually, up here is actually the table. If we go a little above, yes, right here. So this is helpful because it provides a little bit, it's like a quick cheat sheet, if you will. And this is also in the print kit. So again, it provides how many of each card you need. And if we go down, there's the frequently asked questions. Some of the questions that you all asked too, of why does it only focus on the Black-white wealth divide? You know, questions that you might be getting, questions that we certainly got during our time in the field of doing it for a year and a half. In addition, if you scroll further down, you'll see that we actually have talking points for folks and reflection questions. We have the definition of equity right here, but we also have other resources as well as a time for folks to kind of reflect on their own points of privilege so that you as a facilitator, if you're going into the space, you're actually thinking about like how you're seen. So I'll bring up my mom again. My mom is biracial. She's half white and half Black. And she identifies fully as Black, but that's not how she's seen. She's seen as biracial. So it's important to note that. She also dropped out of high school, but when she speaks properly. So a lot of people assume that sometimes she has a college education. So again, it kind of provides this reflection journey of how do I see myself, but then how do other people see me? And based on how their identity is, maybe do they see me differently, right? So that you're thinking about when you go into different groups, you know, how are other people experiencing you? And that's important to note because you may need to check some of those assumptions. You may need to check some of the privilege or just address it so that you're mindful of that. And it also allows for different examples of how you might want to talk about privilege and race, and it has different talking points depending on what your body is mapped to and the people who you're doing this experience with. So I'll go ahead and I'll stop it there. Please, please, please look at the Facilitator's Guide. It's an amazing tool that will help you. All right, Noelia, I'll give it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so, so much. I know we have some folks jumping off. It is, you know, a few minutes after 3 o'clock, but I do want to offer an opportunity for folks who can stay with us for a little bit longer to ask any questions you might have. And folks who do need to jump off, we will be sharing the slides, all of the tools that were mentioned. I'll send a link to the website. You'll also get my email and Marlysa and Marla for questions if they're comfortable. Happy to share those email addresses as well. So folks who do need to jump off, you'll get everything you need, and we definitely hope that you'll follow up and continue to ask those questions and take advantage of the facilitator's guide, the website, the videos that Marlysa mentioned. For folks who can stay for a moment and want to ask any questions, please type them into that Zoom webinar chat, and we'd be happy to pose them to Marlysa and Marla. I know some of them have been answered. There was a question that came up earlier asking about the data that was used. So as you just heard from Marlysa, that's in the policy guide, right? They can learn more. Great.
Yeah, the policy packet. So if you go to bread.org/simulation, which we will be providing after this, then if you go to the policy packet, and we can go ahead and just provide the link to that as well so that you don't have to worry about finding it. It has an extraordinary amount of resources that provide all of that. And then I also provide my own calculations if I made any.
Perfect. Thanks. So we got another question here about this respondent is saying, I've seen in the past with simulations like this one that participants play it safe. So they respond in a way they feel they should respond and not necessarily in a way that truly reflects a change in mindset. So is there any way to control for that? Or how have you taken that into account?
That's so interesting. So I have to say that I haven't actually experienced that. I've experienced other things where a lot of folks are actually very authentic, and sometimes people are authentically angry, right? But I haven't experienced folks kind of shutting out. What I would say is some of the things you might want to do, just kind of with my own background and kind of racial equity, is if you're concerned about it, I would consider thinking about the existing racial dynamics that are in the room. So it could be that for a person like that, it may be helpful to have it racially homogenous and maybe a smaller group that they already have connections with so that the level of trust is there. And we talk about this in the facilitator's guide, that trust is important. And that's why you want to do it with people you know, so that you can have those honest conversations. But I think with that, you're going to want to make sure that you have people in the room who will also hold that person into loving accountability as well. So the loving accountability insofar they aren't speaking up, right? And I think also too, let's say if you have a small group, having an expectation that everyone will respond, I think is important. And maybe setting ground rules of this is a safe space and let's probe each other. And let's be okay with that as a group norm. So if you're feeling like, so I would say like maybe 4 or 5 people, all of the same racial group, and all of folks who have a pre-established relationship and deep trust, I really don't see why a person would feel kind of the need to like shut down. But I would say in addition to that, creating those group norms might be helpful because when you do ask kind of the application questions, then you then build in that kind of normal practice of asking very specifics after if the person is giving a very generic answer.
And I wonder if there's some overlap in that question with this other question that we received about the intellectualization that's still happening after participating in the simulation. So Marla, you mentioned some silence when asking some of the application questions. So I'm wondering if one or both of you can sort of speak to how to work through that. Maybe is it inertia or fear of action or hedging around action? What are your thoughts about that?
Marla, maybe.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, actually, Marlysa and I had a debrief about this, which was great. And I think for us, like, it truly went back to, you know, the structure of agriculture, like we were talking about. That's where that silence came from. I mean, there's a big silence there, because that's a big component of it. So I don't want to gloss over it and say, you know, by doing a simulation that's solved. I think it helps us move forward in that afterwards, we were able to kind of have more impetus behind sourcing some racial equity trainings for our organization internally. So that helped us, you know, it's several steps. Thinking as an organizer myself, I would say, like, you don't need everyone to change sometimes. You just need enough people. And people in those critical pressure points that Marlysa was, you know, outlining before. Like, think about your pressure points and what's going to keep the momentum going. So those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. Thank you so much. So mindful of folks' time, so I'm really excited to see we have almost everyone staying on the line. So I think that just speaks to how much people are feeling a need to for a tool like this and to continue this conversation. So I really want to thank you both again for your expertise and your time and this incredible tool, which we can see here again on this resource page. Again, we'll be sharing this in the email that I'll send out to all the registrants afterwards, and you know, all the other tools that folks have been asking for in the comments as well, the video, the PDF, the facilitator guide, you'll get all of that. There's also some additional resources from the Building Movement Project that you can find on our website. I mentioned earlier that Race to Lead study, you can find that on racetolead.org. If you're looking for additional data and resources about the nonprofit racial leadership gap, the barriers to leadership for people of color. And again, this tool, as well as many other tools from across the sector, are on toolstoengage.org. And we hope that you'll tune in for our next webinar. And just before we go, for folks who are still here, so that we can tailor some of our additional tools and resources that we can offer you, we'd love to know what would be helpful to you in terms of strengthening your practice around applying a racial equity lens to your work. So as we're thinking about this follow-up email and some additional tools that, you know, Marlysa, Marla, or myself might have access to, what you all think would be helpful, we'd love to be specific about then sharing what you need. And we'll give folks just a few more seconds to consider this question. All right. Great. Looks like folks are looking for a racial equity assessment of some kind and some tailored recommendations, as well as an opportunity to participate in or hear some lessons from a community of practice around this, training. I know, Marlysa, people are already asking for your email address to see if they can get you to train with them. Choose all that apply is an answer that we're getting. And again, I have my email address up there for you. If there are other tools or supports you all need within your organizational context, we'd love to hear from you. And I'm happy to pass that info on to Marlysa and Marla. So with that, we want to thank you all so much for spending some of your afternoon with us and engaging in this conversation. And again, Marlysa, Marla, so grateful for your expertise and guiding us through today's conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.